Yes, Jackie hit that ball.
And when he swung his bat, the crowd went wild because he knocked that ball a solid mile. Yeah, boy.
Yes, Jackie hit that ball. Satchel Paige is mellow, so is Campanella. Newcomb and Dobie too. But it's a natural fact, when Jackie comes to bat, the other team is through.
Did you see Jackie Robinson hit that ball? Did he hit it? Yes, and that ain't all. He stole home.
Yes, Jackie's real gone. Jackie's real gone. 'Cause Jackie is a real gone
Robinson hit that ball. It went zooming across the left field wall. Yeah, boy.
Yes, Jackie hit that ball.
And when he swung his bat, the crowd went wild because he knocked that ball a solid mile. Yeah, boy.
Yes, Jackie hit that ball. Satchel Paige is mellow, so is Campanella. Newcomb and Dobie too. But it's a natural fact, when Jackie comes to bat, the other team is through.
Did you see Jackie Robinson hit that ball? Did he hit it? Yes, and that ain't all. He stole home.
Yes, Jackie's real gone. Jackie's real gone. 'Cause Jackie is a real gone
The crowd senses this tremendous situation here. The full spotlight is focused on Robinson at the plate.
Baseball is a game of impact. The powerful contact of the bat with the ball changes its direction. It can change the outcome of the game. The impact isn't just felt by the batter. Other players feel it, Fans near and far feel it, but in 1947, that impact was felt well beyond any field. It was felt by the entire country.
Raise your right hand and repeat after me. I hereby declare on oath.
I hereby declare on oath.
That I will support and defend.
That I will support and defend.
The Constitution and laws.
The Constitution and laws.
Of the United States of America.
Of the United States of America.
The outfield is playing deep and pulled around toward left. The stretch and the pause. Look back toward second. Here comes the pitch. And it comes in wide. And the count now is 1-1 to Jackie Robinson.
It was bigger than the game because it changed everything. Under the watchful eye of thousands, Jackie Robinson heroically stepped forward, determined to break the color barrier of the sport he loved. The crack of his bat became the sound of hope, a brief act, a fraction of a second, yet with everlasting impact. An impact that changed things forever, changed the game, the course of history, changed the whole nation. It changed his own future, the things he would endure, the heights he would reach, the lives he would touch.
Now the right-hander is ready. The count is 1-1. Robinson waits. Here comes the pitch.
For purpose of evasion.
So help me God.
So help me God.
And there goes a line drive to left field. Swan is after it. He leaps it over his head.
Like a ball hit just right, he set us on an irreversible trajectory, reminding us all that not only baseball, but that life itself is a game of impact. How do I know this? Well, Jack Roosevelt Robinson is my dad.
And good evening, baseball and history fans. We welcome you and greetings from the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in the heart of America, Kansas City, Missouri. I'm Raymond Doswell, and I am with the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. We are very excited to have you all here for what we hope will be an impactful discussion on the life, legacy, and impact of the late, great Jackie Robinson. We're pleased to have our very special guest this evening who have volunteered their time to be with us, taking them away from other duties as well as watching baseball. But we're glad that you all are here. And please, there's still time to tell your friends and others to catch us live, both on Facebook and on YouTube this evening. We're very pleased tonight to be joined by our friends at Kansas State University, the Staley School of Leadership, whom we've had a long relationship with over the years, and glad to reintroduce them tonight to help us with this program. We want to send a special shout out to the students of the Staley School who are watching as well and incorporating this as part of their coursework, and all of you who are around the country who are watching and enjoying this. We'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions of our guests in the chat, and we will take your questions near the end of the program, and we're looking forward to hearing from you so that you can be part of the program as well. As I mentioned, we're happy to partner with Kansas State University, and I want to bring in a very good friend who will be our moderator for our program this evening. Please welcome from Manhattan, Kansas, Jay Byland.
Ray, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight to join this esteemed panel to speak on such an important figure. You know, it's not only in sports, but within our narrative as a nation. And I think we forget that Jackie Robinson was a man. He was a father. And that commercial that we just saw really helped remind us of that humanity, his successes and his failures. He was a human being, first and foremost. You know, so many of us knew Jackie Robinson as being the first recognized African-American, at least in the 20th century, that first African-American baseball player to break baseball's color barrier. His was a journey that began in the South, continued over in California on the football and baseball fields, on the cinders of tracks, and into the military. It was in those spaces of his childhood and teenage years where that journey of 1,000 steps began and ended with his last step crossing those chalk lines of Ebbets Field and into history. Many, and I know speaking of my students, not all of us here tonight are baseball fans, but with the season starting anew, we're about to experience the highs and lows of cheering for our own team. Sridhar, who's one of our panelists tonight, and I've already experienced that a little bit this past weekend with his Cincinnati Reds and my St. Louis Cardinals. They took the series 2-1. And so being a fan, it can bring you joy, and it can absolutely tear you into pieces, just like the story of Jackie Robinson, and just like activism, just like leadership. So we teach our students here at K-State that leadership is inherently risky. To take those first steps into the arena, onto the field, or into activism means that you're taking a risk. For some, it's going to be awkward, and it'll certainly be uncomfortable. But for some, it can also be transcendent. And those lessons apply across the board for anyone who wants to step into the arena of activism. So what is it about Jackie that makes him so memorable, an icon that is whose memory has lasted well into the 21st century? And that's why we're here tonight, to talk a little bit about how Jackie took risks in order to become a leader, to become an activist, and to use his platform to affect change in one of our nation's most challenging of times. He's a microcosm of America in the mid-20th century, and many elements of his story still resonate today. So I'm so very excited to be here with Michael Long, the editor of 42 Today, Jackie Robinson and His Legacy. He has edited 2 other books about Robinson, First Class Citizenship, The Civil Rights Letters of Jackie Robinson, and Beyond Home Plate, Jackie Robinson After Baseball. Long is also the co-author with Chris Lamb of Jackie Robinson, a spiritual biography. And he has written about Robinson for the Los Angeles Times, USA Today, and the New York Daily News and the Chicago Sun-Times. Also joining us is Sridhar Pappu, the award-winning author of The Year of the Pitcher, Bob Gibson, Denny McLain, and the End of Baseball's Golden Age. Sridhar is a former columnist with the New York Times and New York Observer. He also served as a staff writer at Sports Illustrated and the Washington Post, and is as a correspondent with The Athletic. And he certainly has one of the better essays in this book. So tonight we're going to start off with Michael. Can you share us a little bit about your background and how it was that you came to write about Jackie? And Sridhar, I'm going to go ahead now and ask you to follow up a little bit after Mike with your own personal journey to Mr. Robinson as well.
Hey, Jay, thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to the museum. Thanks to Ray, and thanks to Sridhar as well for joining us tonight. My entry into Robinson's life is a bit odd. About 15 or 16 years ago, I was in California doing research on Richard Nixon. At the time, I was interested in writing about religion and politics. And an archivist came out to my desk and asked me if I'd seen the Jackie Robinson file. I was at the I was at the National Archives in Laguna Niguel. And this archivist asked me if I'd seen the Jackie Robinson file among these Richard Nixon papers, and I had it. So I looked at it, and it was this huge file of correspondence between Richard Nixon and Jackie Robinson starting in 1952. And that was when they met at the Republican National Convention. They were introduced by a longtime Republican operative, and they hit it off right away. Nixon was recounting a play that Robinson was involved when he played football for the UCLA Bruins. Yeah, he played football for the UCLA Bruins. And Robinson was smitten. And you can see that in the correspondence. But anyway, as I read these letters, I was absolutely captivated. I was taken by Robinson's own take on civil rights and politics and economics. And I was hooked. And so I went back to my hotel room. I thought about it some more. And I eventually called Rachel Robinson to see if she would give me permission to publish a book about Robinson's civil rights letters. And she was kind enough to do it. And from there, it just went on and on and on. But that's really my entree. My entree is through Robinson's civil rights and politics and economics. Did I know about Jackie Robinson before then? A bit. You know, I read the childhood biographies. I knew he was the first Black player to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball in the 20th century. But this was what captivated me.
Thank you for that. And Sridhar?
Mine was by accident as well. I was researching my first book. And anyone who's written a book knows the kind of rabbit holes you're going to fall down. And for me, I was reading a dual biography of Eugene McCarthy and Hubert Humphrey, and I saw this notation about Hubert Humphrey meeting with Jackie Robinson in Chicago the day of the riots there during the DNC. And it just sort of led me into more and more research. One of the things about that first book is it's about baseball, but it's about centers around 1968 and all that. And so a lot of people say, who write books centered around a period of time, especially with sports, like say, well, it's not really about this. Well, I want my book to be really about baseball, right? But for me, I needed a link to the outside world because it was so important. And then he became it, right? In a time when baseball was in such a bubble. He is the link to the outside world. He is the connection to the civil rights movement, to the issues of young versus old in his own dealings with his own children. Everything, you can see it so much in him. And you see his last days as a political power player when Hubert Humphrey begs him to stump for him. And he does. And everything has gone bad in his life, everything. And yet, and this, I've said this before, this is what makes him an American hero. He goes out and he does it. And he is there. And, there's a moment in, I think, game 4 of that series. It is game 4 where Humphrey asks him to go, and he doesn't want to go. He hates going to baseball by this point, but he does it. Does it for Hubert Humphrey because he wants to save the country. And so that just sort of led me into conversations with people like Mike, and then Sarah Burns and Dave McMahon at Florentine Films, and this whole sort of community that has studied Jackie. And of course, it led me to Rachel. And anyone who's gotten the privilege to interview that woman or spend amount of time with her, you just come away just a better person. And so, and that was really the genesis.
All right, thank you. And we're really getting at the crux of it, because Robinson isn't just a baseball player. And I think most of us are stuck on this image of Robinson that's kind of frozen in these first 3 years where he turned the other cheek and played the game without speaking out or standing up, at least in a way that wasn't threatening to white America at the time. And we've really kind of sanitized his memory, when in reality, he's this complicated and nuanced person, and someone that you really have to take great pains to unpack. And so what was it about Jackie Robinson with you all that you were hoping to accomplish in publishing and editing your essays in this book?
Yeah, I think it's still true that we've frozen Jack Robinson in 1947. That continues to be the case. One of the surprising things for me last year when I was watching the Jackie Robinson Day in Major League Baseball was that they actually put Robinson in the context of Black protest movements, which was pretty surprising for me to see, given how Major League Baseball has treated Robinson in the past. In fact, like the rest of culture, it's frozen Robinson largely in 1947, when, as Jay just pointed out, he was non-threatening, relatively safe for America, who thought that we had now overcome America's original sin, right, racism, and that simply didn't happen, though. But that's, I think, what many of us thought. But the book, I think, tries to go beyond that. The whole purpose of the book is to push Robinson beyond 1947, really. We look at him in 1947 a bit, but I wanted the authors to take a deep dive into the complexity of Robinson's life and character. And it was interesting for me to hear Sridhar's comments, because he was really getting to Robinson's solid moral character. And that was what Sridhar's comments were about, if you ask me. And that's what we do in the book. It's difficult to assess somebody's character and then somebody's legacy along with that, because you have to look at it from a variety of angles to get a good assessment of a character or a legacy. And that's what we do in the book as well. We look at it from many different angles. And then you have to look at it over time as well. So when we assess Robinson's character and legacy, we do it by looking at his childhood, his time in 47, his time in baseball, and then far beyond baseball as well. And we try to add some depth to how we understand Robinson. Another real driving force for the book was to place it in contemporary times so that we can see connections between Robinson's historic and historical life and what's going on today in terms of racial justice especially. So those are a couple of the driving factors behind the book.
I think, at least in my contribution, and it goes back to this idea of, yeah, we have frozen him in time, and and I've his life did not, and we're even going backwards, right? We're saying we have him coming into the Major League Baseball in 1947, and that's kind of it, right? And that's what a lot of people know. And he lived an entire life after that, and I think he would say possibly his life was more important after that. I don't, obviously not here, but from the second that he left Ebbets Field, he decided he just took on the role of crusader, and through it became a civil rights power player, which a lot of people forget about. I mean, he is right there in the center with King and Malcolm X and the sort of the internal squabbles between the NAACP and the Southern Leadership Conference. And he's there. He's always there, and he's in the thick of it. And he has a considerable amount of sway. In 1960, you could argue he was one of the most powerful Black people in America. I mean, at a radio show, he had a newspaper column. He had political clout. And then he went to work for Nixon because he thought Nixon was the guy. And so, there is a thing, right? We want to stop. We want to do this. I'm often angry at people who said, well, he should have retired then, right? In terms of athletics. Well, it's his choice. And it was Robinson's choice to go on and sort of make a new identity for himself and become someone beyond baseball. And, I think that's what, I think that's what makes him so great. It also makes him, human, because he has mistakes. He has missteps in there. And we can't just say stop at Branch Rickey and turn the other cheek. We have to go forward not only his career but his life, and it's a lot more complicated, as all lives are. And I think just deserved a sort of greater examination, particularly when it comes to the role of civil rights, because a lot of times people talk about his after baseball life and they remember him campaigning for Nixon, and that's it, right? The GOP especially has been using that for a long time. Michael's written about it, and so it's a lot more nuanced. And I think just bringing about not only how important he was, but how he got involved, and his feelings towards these other figures. And that was my sort of main purpose in writing.
Yeah, and it's interesting. As we enter the 1960s, he's at this top. He's at the pinnacle. As you say, one of the most powerful Black voices in all of America. And so, as we kind of proceed through this decade of unimaginable, kind of unprecedented social change and upheaval, at the end of it, he's at a different kind of place in his life. And so how does he, in your opinion, Sridhar, how does he continue pushing despite, as you say, in your essay, the world begins to fail him? And so what unfinished business does he have? He passes away in 1972. What's the impact of his legacy after he passes away?
In terms of how he pushed, I don't know. I mean, he was a man of such strong moral fortitude, and he was willing to fight. I mean, for those people who don't know, I mean, at a certain stage in his career, I guess, and even in his later days with the Dodgers, diabetes had begun to sort of take a toll on his body. And as the 60s go on, he becomes more and more frail. Even in 1968, he has a heart attack. And so the drive to move forward is his alone, right? It's his idea of making this, putting a world, not to be too cheesy about it, but, leaving a better world than he came into. By 1972, in terms of unfinished business, so much, and like the civil rights movement itself, right? Going in with such promise, and as it goes on, sort of unraveling, and sort of the great ideals of that, of not coming to fruition. I mean, all the leaders, he and Martin Luther King were probably the closest, and he's someone that Robinson never sort of strayed from. I mean, they had, one serious disagreement about Vietnam. We could talk about that, but the world that he left behind is not. I mean, he just wasn't happy with it. He was disappointed in the actions of others. He was disappointed in the lack of progress. I mean, one of the things you're always find with Robinson that's consistent, be it with any political leader, right, is when people were like, "Well, slow down." He's like, "No, we're not going to slow down. We slow down too much. Now is our time." And after the 1960s, and as we enter the 1970s, a lot of civil rights movement comes to a halt. And I think the world that he saw, I mean, he was profoundly disappointed in, and he could be angry about it. I mean, he was. And so the unfinished business that he left is, I think, the business that we're still grappling with. a more equal society for, all races that he believed in and all religions which he believed in.
Yeah, and thank you for that. I don't think any of us watching or participating tonight would go, he wasn't successful, because we think about Jackie Robinson and kind of that legacy that he's left, and we're like, is it because you can't see the forest for the trees? You're involved in this on a daily basis that you can't see the change that you're affecting around you. And so, so much has been said about this constant pushing and cajoling of political and civil rights leaders during the 1960s. And he is this voice of Black Americans that it just weighs heavily on his shoulders. And so as an activist, as we progress through this decade, does it really make him bitter, tired, and worn as he aged through his life after baseball?
I mean, I think so, right? And then, one of the things you have to also remember is, if King is as great, he's also watched the principles of the movement change too. There's a very stark moment when he is leading a protest or a rally in Harlem, and Malcolm X has emerged as this great leader. And Malcolm X would continue to be a gadfly to Robinson, and they had a very complicated relationship. And Robinson's trying to tell the crowd to go away. And then they start, yelling, we want Malcolm, we want Malcolm. And Malcolm X comes out, tells him to go home. They disperse. And, at that moment, it must have been so sad for him, not because he had lost power, but because, the ideals which Malcolm X stood for, at least in that part of his life, in terms, ran so contrary to what he believed. And then, as the decade wore on, and as his personal life, begins to sort of fall apart, he watches the divisions within the movement. He watches, these programs sort of unmet. And then, in 1968, he watches, King, his great ally, who he really truly believed in, whose vision he truly believed in, fall in Memphis. And I think in that moment, and there's, I always talk about this photo, so like Michael, feel free to roll your eyes, but there's a photo of him leaving King's funeral, and the eyes of a man, he looks 100 years old. And he's seen so much and he's fought so hard. And in his autobiography, it's a very angry book, and you can argue whether it was the ghostwriter or him, but he's angry about the lack of progress, and he's just tired. He's just absolutely exhausted. And Rachel said, he was disappointed. He was just disappointed, and he's disappointed that, again, it speaks to his character, right? That he didn't have the physical abilities to, carry on the fight into that next decade, in those next years.
Michael, did you have anything to add on that one, or?
Sure. Since Sridhar focused on the civil rights angle, I can add a little bit to the politics. So Robinson really began to expend a lot of energy leading up to the '64 campaign, and when Barry Goldwater reaches some level of success there, he feels deflated, right? He feels really deflated, and he thinks that the ticket is bigoted and racist. And then 66 and so forth, he's working for Nelson Rockefeller, a progressive Republican in New York. He feels some promise, some encouragement. He helps Rockefeller get votes, and he's hoping that Rockefeller will zoom to the top of the Republican ticket, and that certainly doesn't happen. In 68, Nixon wins office, of course, and Robinson's very frustrated at this point. And that's the word that I remember Rachel using, frustrated. It's really interesting. Maybe we can talk about this another time, but she draws a sharp distinction between him being angry and him feeling frustrated. But in 68, he's definitely feeling frustrated by Nixon and by Agnew. He calls the ticket racist. And he believes that the country at least has become partly captive to Richard Nixon's leadership in the white backlash movement. He's sick and tired of people who are flying flag decals. Who are posting flag decals in their cars, who are flying the flags. He tells the New York Times in 1969 that when he sees a flag decal on somebody's car, he figures that person isn't a friend. He says, "I won't fly the flag on that day or any other day." So that autobiography that Sridhar talked about is angry, and we do question the tone of it sometimes because it might be Al Duckett's. But in 69, Robinson sounds really angry as well. And then the Republican policies, conservative policies, really come into fore, and we see slashes to welfare. We see even Rockefeller slashing social welfare programs and responding to the prison riots with overwhelming force there in Attica. And so Robinson's really upset about that as well. And by the time he dies in 72, he's a beaten man. Sridhar's right about that. He's beaten down, he's frustrated, he's angry, and I want to say he's righteously angry there. So he's frustrated about the civil rights movement, about politics, and then if you just throw on a bit of his family into the mix, it becomes problematic as well, because Jackie Robinson Jr. Had recently died in a car accident, and Sharon has turned to the Black Power movement for inspiration and instruction, and I should say figures like A-Trap Brown and so forth, and that frustrates Jack as well.
Yeah,
I should add that anyone who spends any time with Rachel will make the point that he's not angry. Like that's the first, like to a person, that is the one point that she will actually always say. So
yeah, and I think she's concerned about the racist trope of the angry Black man. I know she is, because it's what she says, and that type of caricature is easily dismissed. And she sees Jack as much more complicated than that trope can ever capture. And she's right about that. She's not right about being angry. I think he's righteously angry. Sridhar?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, you think about this timeline of activism, of social change. It isn't always this linear progression. I think we did that with the integration of baseball. We made it seem as if it's this domino leads to this domino, leads to this domino, and then they all fall and boom, we're integrated. Activism is more of these series of starts and stops, advances and retreats. And so you all touched about it, but is there anything you'd like to expand upon about Jackie's own journey through the civil rights movement, kind of using this lens of this domino and the start and stop, with his conversations with Muhammad Ali and different people with different perspectives during the movement?
Well, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, and again, I hate the word vehicle, but you can actually see the movement, and those auspicious beginnings and his optimism and the sort of vigor he took to it, right? With the sit-ins and the marches and so forth. But like you say, and this is so much American history where we pave it over, right? We have Martin Luther King leading the movement and being the unequivocal leader, and that's not the case. And so he does get involved in these scuffles between and internal battles that sort of help shape the movement, because it's like anything else. And so, everything has been sanitized one way, right? This happened and this happened and this happened. Whereas it gets really complicated, it gets really nasty, and people don't like focusing on that, but it does. And so, I mean, and with that, I think he goes into it a little naivete, and as he learns, he does grow in wisdom and he becomes smarter. But he also, I think those flaws sort of, once those battles start overtaking, the common purpose and the common goals. I think that's where he got frustrated.
Yeah, I would add to that and just say that if you want to see a little bit of complication in Robinson's life, look at his response to violence and nonviolence, right? So in 1947, he's pretty nonviolent there. But he doesn't have a naturally nonviolent personality, as he puts it. He says, "I am not nonviolent." That's a direct quote from Jack Robinson. And he wasn't, right? He went to war. During the Vietnam War, he supported the war. He certainly supported Jackie Jr. as he went off to fight in Vietnam. As Sridhar alluded to earlier, he definitely disagreed with Martin Luther King over the issue of the Vietnam War. King came out and opposed it sharply on April 4th, 1967, in his famous anti-Vietnam War speech, and Robinson wrote about it in a column later, criticizing King for being such a pacifist in response to the war. But at the same time, Robinson distinguished himself from Malcolm X in terms of violence. He stood against the use of any means necessary. He stood opposed to those who were willing to take up arms to advance civil rights. At the same time, he appreciated the Deacons for Defense, who were armed to protect Black people who were not protected by the police. In 1970, he's standing with the Black Panthers as they're facing a trial against police brutality. The guy's really complicated. And so when you talk about the domino effect and you look at it through the lens of violence and nonviolence, there is not a linear track there. We can say that he was not a pacifist. We can say that he was opposed to using violence to advance civil rights. We can say that he supported the use of forceful means to defend Black Americans when white police officers weren't protecting them. We can also say that he was open to war and that he supported the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I know he had some experiences here at Fort Riley, just down the road from Manhattan here, and I know that we're that close because I can hear them practice their artillery late at night, and so we can literally feel the booms when they hit at 2 and 3 in the morning. And so, I appreciate kind of that impact, but it's also interesting is that communism kind of helped lead to his integration of baseball. There was a push there in New York and in Brooklyn, with communism, but on the back end of things, he was pushing back against communism and with the Vietnam War. So there's some, certainly a dichotomy there, and there's certainly some nuances there when it comes to Jack Robinson. So with that being said, I had a real quick, I want to shift because of what happened earlier this week and late last week what would Jackie's thoughts be on the state of baseball today and about what Major League Baseball did in pulling out of Atlanta for the All-Star game? And then think about how does site and place play a role in activism, with Brooklyn and Atlanta. Why was it Brooklyn where Jackie was able to integrate baseball? And what are some of the unique characteristics that each of these places offer? And it even goes to the organizational culture of the Brooklyn Dodgers and kind of how that plays out with the Atlanta Braves in terms of how they responded to Major League Baseball pulling out.
Well, I mean, in terms of when you talk about how he felt about baseball and the state of baseball, you can actually address like how he feels about the game, which is actually at a crossroads. And so much of the game that he and other Negro Leaguers brought to the game, speed, all those kinds of those aspects have been taken away largely by analytics. And also what you've seen is the decrease, the absolute free fall of African-American participation in this game. Again, I was bringing up the story, like someone last year brought up something about how baseball was a white sport. As a child of the 80s, I can list my favorite players: Eric Davis, Kirby Puckett, Bo Jackson, Dwight Gooden. And so I'm just sort of lost in that. And then I look around and, the Reds game last night, and Amir Garrett, who closed out, is the only Black player. And so I think he'd be really disappointed, not only in African-American participation, but also in how the game is played. Buck O'Neil had said, we brought our baseball to Major League Baseball, and that has slowly been stripped away. And, it doesn't resemble that at all, to a point where Major League Baseball is trying to address it because it's become boring. Home runs are boring, and home runs and strikeouts are boring. In terms of what happened in Atlanta, I think he would be so happy. Not the Braves, obviously, but that Major League Baseball went out of its way and was preemptive about it. No, there were no pickets. There was nothing. And Rob Manfred, for once, he's a pretty controversial league commissioner, was out in front of it. And he said, we stand for this and we're not going to do this. And I know he would be really happy. It was a difficult choice. And you see the reaction, right? But the one thing, and a lot of people from the Players Alliance, which if people know it, it's a contingent of African-American players, both past and present, talked about it as just because there's controversy surrounding it doesn't mean it isn't the right thing. And I think he would have stood for with baseball on this because, as he would become sorely disappointed in sport.
Yeah, I certainly second all those comments. I'll just add a little bit to the decline of Black Americans in professional baseball and Major League Baseball. When you look at that problem, I think it's true that baseball isn't as sexy as some of the other sports. I think that's given, at least it is for me. Kids seem much more attracted to football, right, and to basketball especially. But there are also significant social forces behind that decline, right? So there's a lack of green space in a lot of urban areas. And there are some economic forces there driving participation down. It takes a lot of money to put together a team. And so there's another significant issue. And Robinson was about investing in local communities of color when he developed his Jackie Robinson Construction Company. He was all about investing in the local community of color. And I think he'd be disappointed that Major League Baseball might have built some pipelines to other countries rather than through some inner cities and through even suburban areas here in the United States, and allowed some of the deconstruction to happen and the destruction to happen as well. So I think he'd be concerned about the underlying social forces that have fueled the decline of Black Americans in Major League Baseball. And that's a key point, because Robinson really dug deeply when he approached politics and civil rights. I mean, he went to the economic core. This was a guy who believed that civil rights could be best achieved through the ballot and the buck. And if the buck isn't there, you got real problems, according to Robinson. And one of those problems, I believe, is the decline of Black Americans in Major League Baseball.
Yeah, and one of the things we talk about with social activism is that you have to get to the core. You have to address the structural problems that exist in society, that you don't just address the symptoms. You have to get to the root, to the crux of the matter. And it sounds like that Jackie really identified with that early on, and he pulled no punches. He went right at the heart of the matter. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but I do want to talk a little bit about the role of religion in activism. Ricky's faith, Robinson's faith, they both played a role in their decision to push forward with the integration of baseball, among other stuff, with LaGuardia and the legal legal push there in New York, or as you say, the buck at the turnstiles. But can you speak to that role of religion and some of the ways that Ricky was an activist himself, and maybe speak a little bit to what about Jackie's connection to the Methodist Church and the AME churches as well?
Yeah, how about I start with Robinson? He inherited his Methodist faith from his mother, who was a big believer. And it seems as if, by all accounts, she was a fundamentalist believer, spent a lot of time in prayer and in reading the Bible and so forth. And I'm not sure that always sat so well with Jack, but it fueled her desire to leave Georgia and to go to California. She put the kids on the train. She called it the Freedom Train. They were going to the Promised Land. Of course, the Promised Land is never quite the Promised Land, but it was California. And when they settled in Pasadena, she took all the kids to Scott Methodist Church. And Robinson at that point wasn't a big fan of going to church at all. But his mother passed on some really important faith lessons. One was that his color was full of dignity. And she taught him the Adam and Eve story. I'll just tell you this pretty quickly. She told him the Adam and Eve story this way. She said Adam and Eve were originally black, and then they became scared white, pale, when God saw that Eve had eaten of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and discovered that they were sinful. And she taught him that story to say that the color of your skin is ordained by God. It's part of God's original intention. And so he grew up believing that this color of his skin was full of dignity, and he was full of dignity. He was a child of God, as Rachel has described Robinson's beliefs. Robinson's mother also taught him that freedom is to be grasped here and now. That's what that freedom train is all about. It's not to be looked at as something that we achieve in the by and by up there in heaven somewhere, but it's something to work for here. Freedom is something that we co-create with God, according to Mally Robinson. So she taught him these really important lessons. And then as he grew older at Scott, they got a new pastor there, Reverend Carl Everett Downs, and he really pulled Robinson into the church. And Robinson became really enamored with this young pastor, this young, vibrant pastor, who taught him that faith is about affecting and changing one's community. That lesson stuck with Robinson the rest of his life. So he takes these spiritual lessons with him into baseball and then throughout the rest of his life. And they act as a lot of the fuel. He never wore his faith on his sleeve. That's very clear. Near the end of his life, they weren't regular churchgoers. That's very clear as well. But it continued to provide the fuel for his life. In terms of Ricky, I can say, I'll just add very quickly that he was a pious Methodist, deeply affected by his mother. As many of you know, he didn't want to go to games on Sunday, but he was more than willing to accept the funds, the money from those games. He brought Robinson in for a variety of factors. And he did appreciate that they were both Methodists. He also appreciated that Robinson could make the turnstiles click, as somebody famous once put it. So Ricky was a complicated man as well.
This is my area, so I have nothing to add.
I was just double checking. I had that dramatic pause set up for you. All right. Well, such as the awkwardness of being and all of that good stuff. So, thank you for sharing that. And so what I'd like to do is start shifting it back into what we look at today. And so, what was some of Jackie's impact upon his contemporary athletes in their pursuit of activism? Not everyone agreed with his platform. Not everyone agreed with his message. So, what connections, direct or indirectly, can we make today in our current climate where there's a portion of society that believes athletes should just stick to sports and shut up and dribble?
I mean, it's funny that, when Robinson starts working, especially with the NAACP, he actually openly says, "I wish I had been more of an activist while I was playing." And, that really struck with me because he has regrets about that, especially when he has when he thought he had a bigger platform and he didn't say much. I mean, he had a famous misstep, I'll just say it, testifying against Paul Robeson, essentially against Paul Robeson in front of the House Un-Americans Committee. But he and so later in life, and, it's one of those things where you pigeonhole someone where he's viewed as sort of conservative. And after the 1968 Olympics, there's a show that he's on with Bill Russell. I'm blanking on the names, Arthur Ashe, and some other very, very prominent African-American athletes. And he talks about how proud he is of John Carlos and Tommy Smith and what they did. And some people who didn't know him were shocked by it. But it was that, thing, the idea of individual courage, that they stood there and did that. I mean, he did not agree with Muhammad Ali, especially in his decision not to fight. But he also said he admired the courage. And that's one thing that always comes across, right? Mm-hmm. The ability to stand up for something, whether he believed it or not. And so, I mean, in the athletes of his time, while he might disagree with them, surprising. I mean, you'll see more surprising links there than you wouldn't. I know for a fact, and Michael and a lot of people do, it's like, he was sorely disappointed in that generation that came after him, and the African American players that came after him. And he essentially used the word, there are a bunch of do nothing Negroes. I mean, he said, I have Bill White, I have Curt Flood, and I forget the third player, but that's it. And I know he was disappointed, and I think it's probably because afterwards he had seen the effect that he could have playing baseball if he had said something, whether he could or not during the time period, I don't know. And he was sort of, I mean, I think he was disappointed that at that moment of social change that more baseball players, African American players, didn't stand up.
Yeah, he was disappointed with his own generation too, right? So Campanella and then later Willie Mays and so forth. He was disappointed in Muhammad Ali. You're right about that, but I love that point that you make. I mean, the politics between those two men were quite divergent, and yet there's Robinson praising Ali because he's getting involved in politics and standing up for his convictions. So that's really dramatic, and there's a little nod to bipartisanship, isn't it? I think that he really did appreciate Curt Floyd and even testified at Floyd's trial, which is pretty dramatic to me when I think about it, and the ways that he helped change Major League Baseball. There's one other person I wanted to mention, and that was Frank Robinson. Jack Robinson was really hard on Frank Robinson, who became the first black manager in baseball, right? But he thought Frank Robinson was gunning for that job, and as he was gunning for the job, just decided to stay apolitical, and that did not sit well with Robinson at all. Sridhar, did you have anything to add there?
Not in terms of like Frank Robinson, but you mentioned Willie Mays, and I mean, his attacks on Willie Mays were pretty vicious.
Yeah.
And they were pretty unfair, I think. It's like, because not anyone can be Jackie Robinson, and I think because of his own moral strength and his own moral character and his own courage, sometimes he was sort of blinded by the fact that not anyone could, stand up and be that person. Willie Mays was not that person.
Mm-hmm.
But he could be, a pretty cruel in his assessment and openly cruel about the assessment. But yeah, I mean, I think watching that generation in particular, after his, was particularly hard for him.
And so, as we try to wrap this up a little bit in terms of bringing it back to what we've talked about in today's society, so many of our students here played sports in high school. Some in college are still playing. But for others, sports is really irrelevant to their daily life. Now, for Jackie, he was an athlete, but he was also an activist. So, what advice would you give our students or people just in general who are watching who don't have the connection to athletics and activism, and at least in terms of the lessons that they can take away from Robinson, and how can they take those lessons and still find ways of being a leader within their own community?
Well, I mean, I think what a lot of the book explores, because it deals with his life outside of baseball, is that sort of nuance, that 360, it's what made him a human being, right? And so I think the fact that he played Major League Baseball, it gave him a name, it gave him a platform. But, his activism, it was a separate part of his life. He didn't need to play Major League Baseball in order to do the things that he did. Of course, he was on the big stage, but, it required that effort. It required that belief in the sort of betterment of humanity and the fact that you could change it. I mean, it had nothing, again, Jackie Robinson would not be Jackie Robinson without baseball. But, in terms of like ordinary people, in terms of ordinary lives, he admired courage. I mean, that's why he was there, when he would go, to places, especially like in the Deep South. Famously, he traveled to Mississippi and spent time at a fundraiser with Curt Flood and with Med Gravers. I don't know how long afterwards he was assassinated. But he went to these places and saw the lives of ordinary Americans who were sacrificing so much in order to better the country. And, that had nothing to do with sports. And so, I mean, I think that if you move beyond that, if you move beyond the baseball player and get to the man, I mean, I think that he would really appreciate, people, just putting yourself out there.
Yeah, I think that last expression is great, putting yourself out there. I was just revisiting Robinson just before he was going to Birmingham in 1963 to join up with the movement. He was going down with Floyd Patterson, and they were going to talk to the adults in the movement and then the kids. And Robinson's talking with these news folks before he's going down. He says, I'm not sure about going down. I'm a bit of a coward, and I don't want to be bitten by any dogs. And then he said, and I'm a bit of a coward, as I said, and I certainly don't want to go to jail. And then he later told another news reporter that he really didn't want to go to jail because he was claustrophobic, and he was scared about having to land in jail. But there he went. He put himself out there anyway. And I can just imagine him being afraid of dogs and not wanting to go to jail. So those two images have really were sticking in my mind, or were coming to my mind as Sridhar was talking. But yeah, putting yourself out there is what Robinson did. And you know what he says? He said, I think I became much more aggressive after baseball. Which is really odd, isn't it, when we think about how dramatically aggressive and assertive he was in baseball. And then I want to go back to Sridhar's earlier comments, and I do believe that Robinson believed that all the exploits on the baseball diamond paled, if I may use that expression, compared to his later work in politics and civil rights. There was a time when he went to Operation Breadbasket in Chicago and visited with Jesse Jackson, who at that point was a new young voice in the civil rights movement, and Robinson saw a lot of promise in them. He called him the new Black Moses. And then after visiting with Jackson in the Operation Breadbasket, he went to an event that was honoring him and his time in sports. And he later wrote an Operation Breadbasket figure saying that the two events didn't compare at all. The Operation Breadbasket event was the one that was so meaningful to him. And so I do believe that despite his historic success in Major League Baseball, that really paled in his mind when he looked at the rest of his life. And by the way, may I just say, thanks to all those people out there who are still watching, it's not easy to have an event about Jackie Robinson and focus on his politics and civil rights and his views on society and culture. So thank you all for sticking with us.
All right. So we do have one question so far that I'd like to drop in real quick, and it's from Kevin. So Kevin, thank you very much for the question. And the question is Jackie really complicated, or is he just feeling the pressure of the day, of the moment, no more than any other Black man or woman may feel today?
I think it's complicated. I mean, based on his upbringing, his experiences in the Army, his relationship with Rachel. I mean, you have to understand that he was always an evolving person, right? And you can see it, and not only in those involvements with other people, but within his own family. I mean, there's a point where Rachel decides she's going to go back to school. I mean, go to nursing school, and she was, I mean, not to use the word tenure track, but she was a rising star at Yale. And there's one point where I think he confesses to Sharon, it's after Branch Rickey died. And he said, I lost Mr. Rickey, I've done it, and now I'm losing your mother too. And so you see a man seeing the modern world and not knowing what to do with it, right? All of a sudden he's at home. So, all these different kinds of things factor in his life and into his thinking. And he had, and again, the idea of him seeing so much, but we have to get past, I mean, again, with any figure in history, we have to get past this sort of one-dimensional slope that we see him, because once you sort of unpeel that, that's when their true nature comes to light. So
yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. That was a brilliant answer. I agree. I agree with that brilliance.
We have that on recording, Sridhar, so you're good here.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to pull in one for just for all the K-Staters out there that are still here, and because you all are the experts on Jackie Robinson, you've written on him. We're here tonight. How has his story and your research really changed your philosophy on leadership and activism? What did you think about it going into this exploration into Jackie Robinson, and how has he been able to transform your opinions?
Well, I think in terms of just, again, in the scope and looking at how he viewed things and he viewed personal relationships, that it's okay to disagree with things, right? You can be a good person and you can believe in a greater cause and not agree with everything. And so I think by showing that, I mean, when King gives that speech, for instance, he says, I disagree with everything, but he's still my leader. And so I think in that sense, it sort of broadened my perspective, especially in the day and age of sort of Twitter pylons, right? When every single thing is sort of broken down, like, oh no, you're with me, or this and that. Well, I mean, if anything we can learn about Jackie Robinson is that you can still be a moral man, you can still fight for bigger causes, but you can still have disagreements within that cause.
Yeah, that's nicely put. The other thing I would add is my admiration for Robinson's refusal to give up on just basic rights. He wasn't arguing for special rights. He was arguing for civil rights. And he refused to waver on that. In 1957, when King was supporting the Civil Rights Act as it came through Congress, and as most other Black leaders were supporting the Civil Rights Act as it came through Congress, and as all the white politicians rallied around it as well, Robinson was still hammering away at better legislation, saying the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which is now historic, just wasn't good enough. It was half a loaf and we should refuse it. I love that part of Jack Robinson, just not surrendering on basic rights. We're so inclined sometimes just to sacrifice our basic rights to get along or to get half a loaf, as he put it. And he simply was uncompromising on that point. And I think that uncompromising part of his character would go a long way to building somebody's leadership character as well. Was he right about 1957? I don't know, but it would have been great had we had the whole loaf.
All right, so we did have one question from our lead. Okay, we do have actually two left, and so we have one with Maria said, like to talk about his feelings on Black excellence and how the dignity in his race. Did that complicate his legacy or his ability to be an activist when the league and the world around him was failing him?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, he, like Michael alluded to, I mean, he was very, he's a proud Black man. I mean, Rachel doesn't want him to be an angry Black man. And again, that term bothers me as well, and it should bother a lot of people. But in terms of, the pride and who he is and where he came from, I mean, it influences everything he does, I mean, from a very early age. That said, the compassion that he showed and why he differentiated from, couldn't always agree with Malcolm X is, that compassion he had for other religions, other faiths, other races. I mean, he was famously, and a lot of people forget, and about, the Jewish American tide, the civil rights movement, and he never left that behind. And especially, I mean, that's what he took on with a lot of members of the Black Power movement, and in sort of the more anti-Semitic terms. But yeah, I mean, it really did influence everything that he did and everything he pursued, in his work.
All right, Mike, I know you.
He said I'm a Black American first. I said I'm a Black man first and an American second. At UCLA, he wore bright white starched shirts to accentuate the color of his skin. But at the same time, he didn't see Black excellence competing with excellence among his other people of color or other religions. Sorry, Jay, I didn't mean to cut you off like that. Okay.
No, I know you got to jump off. We have one last question. It says, does anyone know Robinson's feelings towards or regarding Dick Allen, who in many ways carried some of the same scars as Robinson, although from a different era and with a different demeanor?
Yes, because that third person that I can remember, Kurt Flood, Bill White, and Dick Allen was the third. So he admired Dick Allen, and who again had a complicated history within the sport. I think we're still unpacking his legacy, but I know that Robinson really admired him and saw him as sort of a leader in the cause within baseball.
And I have nothing to add there, other than to say, go ahead, Jay.
I was going to say, I know you got to jump off, so I'll let you kind of close out.
Okay. Hey, thank you all very much. I appreciate it. Sridhar, great to see you again. Jay, wow, what a great moderator. So thank you very much. And thank all of you for attending to Robinson's legacy. First-class citizenship. That's what he was after. Good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And I'd like to thank everybody out there. Sridhar, great job. I certainly enjoyed working with you there. I don't know if you want to stick around. Oh, you're welcome, Gasper. Didn't know if there's anything else that came through the chat. Ray, I didn't know if you want to pop on and kind of see where things are, but it's certainly was a great conversation. I certainly appreciate the energy and the expert research you all brought to the table.
And we want to thank Michael and Sridhar for being with us this evening, for all of you for attending and being part of this. Gaspar, thanks for your question. Gaspar is a friend of the museum and an excellent filmmaker on integration of baseball and on Muhammad Ali. He will be part of an event that's upcoming through this platform on April the 19th on Muhammad Ali. Stay tuned for more information on that. Next week, April 12th, Jay will be back with us along with the university, Kansas State, and we'll have a great conversation with reporter and journalist Howard Bryant, who will have plenty to say
Yes.
about Robinson and many others, as well as some of the events today. You know Howard, and we know that he will not mix words. So we're very excited to have him as part of this event, and we're very proud to have you all here with us. So without further ado, please, thanks to all of you, thanks to our members and donors, we encourage you to become a member of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. You can go to nlbm.com and you can buy the book 42 Today through the NLBM Extra Any Museum store online, and there is a copy. You can buy it with us online or wherever books are now being sold. Again, thank you to Michael and Sridhar and to Jay and the students at K-State, as well as all of you for joining us. This will be available on our YouTube channel and on Facebook, on our Facebook page to watch again if you need more information. So from all of us here in Kansas City, thank you and good night.